Star Trek returns after a fashion with Atari Archive's history of Star Raiders. September 1982 marked the end of an era for the Atari video computer system. For starters, today's two games represent the final ones released under the Sears label, with Submarine Commander the final Sears exclusive at that. Secondly, these are the last games released under the picture label on the cart and colorful box motif the company has been using since March 1981 and August 1977, respectively. Furthermore, these are the final games released under the VCS labeling. In October 1982, Atari published the Atari 5200 Super System and retired the VCS name in the process. From that point forward, the VCS became known as the Atari 2600, and as 5200 games had silver boxes with blue labels, for the duration of that system's life on the market, 2600 games came out in silver boxes with red labels. This doesn't mean that older games suddenly had new boxes and labels, mind you. Still, Star Raiders makes for a heck of a game to end this period of VCS publishing on. This is a console rendition of Atari's critically acclaimed computer game of the same name, one that was considered for quite some time to be one of the best computer games available. Throughout 1982, different companies had produced their own VCS renditions of Star Raiders. See Imagic's Star Voyager, Activision's Star Master, and Arcadia's Phaser Patrol. But come September, Atari brought forth the official conversion, ably brought to the platform by developer Carla Meninsky. The original Atari 8-bit Star Raiders was developed by Doug Neubauer, who has been quite open to discussing the game's origins in articles, in interviews, and even on his own website. As I alluded to in the intro, Neubauer has said that Star Raiders stemmed from two major influences, the 1977 movie Star Wars, as well as Star Trek. Not the TV series, but rather the computer game initially developed by high schooler Mike Mayfield in 1971. Star Trek found its way into various program libraries, the book 101 Basic Computer Games, practically every computer platform under the sun, and even the Atari VCS under the name Stellar Track. I encourage you to check out my video on that particular game for a deeper dive into the history of Mayfield's Star Trek, but needless to say, once you understand the premise of that older title, the linkage to Star Raiders is difficult to ignore. In the text-based, turn-based Star Trek, your mission is to destroy all of the Klingon warships in a randomly generated galactic map within a specified amount of time. You have to search them out by exploring and scanning galactic sectors, and then managing your limited energy supplies as you get into fights with those vessels. As you take hits, your ship can be damaged and use up much of your finite energy supply, requiring you to visit a starbase to refuel and repair. The game ends when you destroy all the Klingons, are destroyed yourself, or run out of time. The game will provide you with a final ranking based on how quickly you completed it, and if you managed to destroy all the Klingons. As a game, it is remarkably sophisticated for the time it was initially developed, and its relatively low technical requirements and readily available basic code made it easy to convert to new platforms, or even modify and improve upon. Neubauer came to Atari from National Semiconductor, which at one time was planning its own home computer system based around the Intel 8080 microprocessor. Neubauer was tasked with developing a couple games such as Turtle Derby and a computer space clone, both of which went as unreleased as the computer did, according to a 1994 interview on dadgum.com and his own musings on his personal website. When the computer was cancelled, most of that group went to Atari, and Neubauer found himself working under Jay Miner, one of the architects of the VCS. There, Neubauer found himself developing the logic used in the Pokey chip, a vital component for the Atari 8-bit computer that handled audio and input-output processing. Once he and his team of National Semiconductor alumni finished their work on the Pokey, they all had some downtime waiting for the other teams to complete their parts of the computer design, and Neubauer spent it creating what eventually became Star Raiders, and indeed, one of the first games for the hardware. He explained that he wanted to make something that had the 3D cockpit sensation of Star Wars or even Star Trek, but since he'd never seen anything of the sort done before, he had to work out the best approach, eventually sitting down, calculating out the relevant trigonometry, and using that. He remarked later that his routines were pretty sloppy, as there hadn't been any true 3D game that needed that degree of complexity before. And as a result, the game slows down immensely when there's a lot of particles on screen as it works through his code. The galactic map and the starbases used to resupply were inspired by Mayfield's Star Trek, he wrote in his website, and allowed him to marry strategy to the dogfighting action his cockpit mode brought with it. A 2007 interview with Gamasutra saw Neubauer credit Star Wars and Battlestar Galactica for some of the visual design inspirations, which is incredibly obvious when you see the sprites of the Xylon fighter and base stars. Neubauer brought an early version of Star Raiders to show off at the West Coast Computer Fair in May 1979, where it reportedly turned some heads. While the Atari 400 and 800 computers came out at the end of 1979, advertising suggests that Star Raiders didn't arrive until closer to March 1980, with no indication it was available before that point. Playing the game, particularly in 1980, makes it abundantly clear why this became the bar by which other computer games had to measure up against. Star Raiders sees you as a member of the Atarian starship fleet and tasks you with wiping out all of the invading Xylon ships in a 16 by 8 galaxy map, as they have broken a peace treaty and have brought about a state of war. The starbases and Xylon fleets are all randomly positioned each time you load the game, though, unlike Star Trek, you do get to see where everything is located without needing to scan sectors. Warping between sectors takes time and energy dependent on how far a jump you're making it important to be judicious with your travel. And of course, even if you've scanned an enemy fleet, that doesn't mean they'll still be in the same sector. The Xylons are after your starbases and will periodically move from one sector to another on their way to destroy them. Their speed is dependent on how large a given fleet is, and their movement has enough randomization in it that they will not be bunched up into an interstellar traffic jam. If they have sufficient numbers to threaten a starbase, you'll receive an alert and get 1 minute to move and defend the base. Failing that, you can destroy it yourself to prevent Xylons from using its debris to build more ships. Once you're in the same sector as a Xylon fleet, the meat of the game begins. Using your long-range scanner and your targeting computer systems, you need to close the gap with your foes until they're in targeting range. If your targeting computer is functional, then it should be relatively straightforward to get a lock-on and fire a homing photon torpedo at them. Of the 3 types of enemy ships, 2 of them are more or less identical, identifiable as a TIE fighter from Star Wars and an upside-down U-shape reminiscent of a Klingon warship from Star Trek. The final one is a base star and looks exactly like the vessels of the same name from Battlestar Galactica. These are the most dangerous as they have shields that protect them from any distant fire, requiring you to close the gap before you can take them down. You can choose to have your shields up, which drains more energy but also protect you from taking as much damage from enemy fire. This is important, as just as in many variations of Star Trek, your ship's systems are prone to taking damage. If they're partially working, you may be able to keep fighting. For example, a damaged photon torpedo means that you only have 1 functioning launcher, but a destroyed system means you can't fire back at all. Damaged engines will only work intermittently, as another example, while destroyed engines mean you can really only move by activating your hyperdrive and aborting before you leave the sector. You also have to watch for meteors floating around a sector, as they will damage your ship on any skill level above Novice. Repairs can only be conducted by traveling to a starbase and docking with it, which will see a little ship come out to repair and resupply your fighter. Neubauer remarked he originally wanted you to go inside the starbase, but all his interior designs wound up looking extremely blocky like a VCS game. He then tried just having it shoot a resupply beam, but technician Steve Smith told him that it was rather lame, and the resupply ship was the solution he settled on that everybody liked. Instead of a score, the game features a ranking system, another feature Neubauer credits to Mayfield's Star Trek. Here, your ranking is based off of how much energy you use, how many enemy ships have been destroyed, the number of starbases destroyed, and whether or not it was by you or the Xylons, the skill level chosen, and how much time it took to successfully finish the game. As I mentioned earlier, if all this sounds a bit familiar, it's because Star Raiders served as inspiration for several VCS games we've already seen debut in 1982. Star Voyager adapted its cockpit battles, while Star Master and Phaser Patrol in particular pulled from the whole of its design. Yet for everything they do well, it's hard to hold a candle to the original. Star Raiders on the Atari 8-bit computers is an absolute masterpiece that not only shows what Atari's computer could do, but what computer gaming could be. And even if Atari itself waffled on whether or not they wanted the 400 and 800 to be business machines, or recreational sources of games as well, Star Raiders put a pretty clear thumb on which way the company would have been best suited to stick to. Neubauer's website digs into some other anecdotes about its development. For example, the photon torpedo sound was originally supposed to be a sampled version of the one from Star Trek, but it took so many bytes to implement that he wound up with a pokey-generated effect instead. That said, the acknowledging 3 beep sound the computer makes when you enter a command is a straight adaptation of a sound cue the Enterprise computer makes to confirm a self-destruct order. The "what's wrong" message when you hit the wrong key is a reference to George Lucas's film THX 1138. While the meteor and photon graphics are the same, just with an extra bit of RNG added to the latter to add a sparkle effect. In a 1986 interview, Neubauer also remarked that with more memory available on cartridge, or with a disk drive for storage, he would have liked to have added planets and planet landings, a trench run sequence, as well as more charts and subcharts that could be called up. But what came out in 1980 was duly impressive. In the Atari 50 collection, former Atari engineer Jerry Jessup reminisced about checking out an Atari 800 and the prototype Star Raiders before the computer had made its retail debut practically every weekend. And arcade developer Owen Rubin similarly recalled how popular the game was within the walls of Atari. At the time it released, there was simply nothing else like Star Raiders, and when reviews began cropping up for the game, they were nothing short of effusive. Greg Williams reviewed the game for Byte's May 1981 edition, heaping praise on its innovations, its real-time animations, and ultimately concluding that words could not describe the sensation of actually playing it. Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz devoted an entire column to it in video later that year, dubbing it a home arcade event of the first magnitude, only behind the invention of Pong and the debut of the Atari VCS, and the greatest game ever burned to a ROM cartridge. They considered it fulfilling the entertainment potential of computers more than any other game to that point, adding that it was impossible to praise it too highly. Even local computer clubs had nothing but glowing remarks. The Atari 400 and 800 Users Group newsletter gave it an A+, while Purser's magazine talked about its challenge, its graphics, and its addictive nature, noting that the better you got at it, the more it would demand of you. Local newspapers reported on kids hovering around computer shops to play the game when they couldn't run it at home. Kunkel and Katz awarded it the Best Computer Game of the Year for the 1981 Archie Awards, proclaiming that it treated players to pulse-pounding action and all the bells and whistles you could ask for. When Electronic Games created its Video Game Hall of Fame, its readership nominated Star Raiders, as well as Williams' arcade game Defender, as the first 2 entries outside of those selected by the editorial staff. Furthermore, the magazine noted it was continuously selected as among the most popular games among its readers in monthly polls. Evidently, Atari saw it as impressive too. The company initially announced Star Raiders' VCS port at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show back in January 1982 for a September release, a date that the company kept to. Similarly, the company followed through on the announcement that a Star Raiders conversion for the impending Atari 5200 would be a launch game in October. Programming duties for the VCS port fell to Carla Meninsky, who had returned to the company after quitting for another job. She had been asked to work on a graphics hack of her game Dodge'em as part of a promotion with Mercedes, and saw that the company had changed working conditions dramatically during her 3-month absence. Meninsky was lured back with a new role as a game group leader, allowing her to do game design, primarily around licensed properties like the Muppets. She unfortunately has only really done one interview and only touched on Star Raiders briefly, noting that it was an 8KB cartridge, something Atari, to this point, had only used with its Asteroids conversion, but would be relying on very heavily going forward with this ever creakier hardware. The manual shifts the setting ever so slightly. The Xylon name has been swapped with Krylon, and you are set as a member of a crew alongside Commander Champion and Lee-San O'Rourke to chase after their fleet and avenge the doomed planet. While Starmaster and Phaser Patrol got around the simplistic VCS controller by using the switches on the console itself to handle all the extensive controls a Star Raiders-esque game requires, Atari's rendition instead came bundled with a video touchpad controller. By plugging this into the second player slot and using the included overlay, the player can operate their ship without needing to flick switches. The touchpad handles toggling between the cockpit view and the galactic map, hyperspace jumps, and if your computer and shields are on or off. Oddly enough, the video touchpad is internally the same design as the older keypad controller that Atari debuted in 1978, just with a new form factor. The company would go on to do this again with its Sesame Street line of games and the Kids controller. Coverage at the time suggested Atari intended to use the video touchpad for more games, but ultimately, aside from the Sesame Street titles, which didn't provide overlays for the Star Raiders edition, it never happened. The touchpad is an interesting solution to the problem that Phaser Patrol and Star Master addressed using the console switches. In those games, you use the switches on the VCS itself to control systems, and in both, the console is used to flip back and forth from your galactic map to your cockpit view, and Phaser Patrol additionally uses it to manage your shield systems. Here you can opt to keep your shields and targeting computer always on by setting the difficulty switches to B, but otherwise everything else is handled from the touchpad. Star Raiders for the VCS seems paced around the need to flip between controllers, though you'll likely have that classic experience of trying to navigate your computer systems while getting shot at. Furthermore, while both Arcadia and Activision's clones focus on copying Neubauer's work as closely as possible, Meninsky took some liberties with her adaptation. For starters, there is only one alien fleet, and your difficulty setting adjusts how many ships are in it. The lowest starts you with 10, while higher levels pit you against 20, 30, or 40 foes. This fleet will make its way towards your singular starbase with the exact pace dependent on how many ships are left in it. The different difficulty levels also adjust how much energy you can store, how accurate and how often Krylon ships fire on you, how likely you are to take damage, and whether or not your starbase and the fleet will start on opposite ends of the map or in random positions. Like in Neubauer's game and its VCS clones, taking damage can result in your ship systems malfunctioning or being destroyed, with varying degrees of seriousness. Warping to the same sector as the starbase will top off your energy and repair all damage immediately, allowing you to get right back to work. Finally, as long as your attack computer is active, your ship will continue to follow the Krylon fleet, sector by sector, anytime they warp out on you, albeit with a delay. For a good score, it's good to keep track of when they leave so you can follow them quickly, but this is a welcome feature given how difficult the game can be. The biggest shift between Meninsky's Star Raiders and Neubauer may be how they handle combat. In both games, alien ships are darting all around the space near your ship, and periodically they'll get behind you and start firing unless you can slip around and start shooting back. There's also a targeting computer that's ostensibly useful for getting a bead on your enemies to destroy them. That's about where the similarities halt, though. In Neubauer's game, getting a lock-on means you'll fire a pair of torpedoes that will seek out your foes. Here on the VCS, there is no homing function. A lock-on, signified by a shift in targeting computer color, and a beep, instead lets you fire 2 torpedoes at once. The manual suggests your target range is actually the bottom half of the screen, and this is about the only way to actually hit anything. At the same time, the 3 types of enemy fighters, which carry over from the computer game, are going to be moving around erratically and quickly, making it actually pretty difficult to get a bead on them within that firing range. This is really where the challenge of VCS Star Raiders comes in, and it takes a lot of getting used to coming in from other takes on the original. You essentially have to get used to staying relatively motionless and let your enemies zip into a spot where you can blast them, while trying to avoid return fire to the extent you can. There's a level of patience required to succeed here, as well as carefully watching your scanner to make sure that when an enemy is about to emerge in your firing range, you can blast it immediately. The longer they're allowed to linger near the top of the screen, the more hits you're going to take. With all 3 ships returning from the Atari 400 cartridge, base stars are just as bothersome here as they are on the older release, with their shields. Additionally, you'll need to contend with asteroid fields at the start of the game and when you're down to one final enemy fighter, forcing you to maneuver around the rocks to avoid damage and also, frankly, messing up your targeting. Personally, I can ace pretty much any other take on Star Raiders, but this one is tough enough that I found myself no better than the rank of Pilot 3 on the lowest difficulty setting, and only managing to clear it on the T10 and T20 modes. Other players online, such as those on the Atari Age forum, echo this sentiment, with near universal agreement that it's nearly impossible to save the starbase, and that the best you can do is get a top-up on energy and repairs there before it blows. That said, the game is still quite fun and well considered, if a bit odd. More than any other game of this type, it feels like a real war of attrition against your enemies, since they're traveling in one large group and are, frankly, brutal attackers regardless of difficulty level. It's a remarkably tense experience to have to take out the last few fighters after losing your starbase, and essentially are on your own, only to discover one of them is a base star. As an aside, the game does appear to have an Easter egg in it. After you successfully complete the game, pushing the hyperspace button will replace your rank with a different one, typically the highest mystery rank, Atari, but sometimes it'll just give you gibberish. Meninsky's VCS version of Star Raiders may be stripped down compared to the original, but it also saw similarly positive coverage. Electronic Games called it an outstanding achievement for how much of the original game was kept for the VCS. Video Game Update called it a must-have title for space game fans and considered it a good translation. Lou Hudson, writing for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, found it good, but not quite as good as Star Master, a game he wrote about several times as his favorites on the platform. Joystick was very high on the VCS Star Raiders, describing it as the best strategy combat game available and an amazing transition to the platform. It also gave it a multi-page strategy spread in its April 1983 issue, noting that even there it was a difficult game to master. Furthermore, the magazine gave Meninsky's title several honorable mentions in its 1983 Golden Joystick Awards, where it almost, but not quite, won the award for Best Game of the Year, Space Game of the Year, and Most Challenging. Logical Gamers split on the adaptation, as Alan Bechtold felt it was a noble attempt but fell short of Star Voyager or Star Master in execution, while Mike Wilson liked it a great deal, with the added note that it required a lot of quick decision-making he was ill-suited to. TV Gamer gave Star Master a slight edge over Star Raiders, but still described it as a good game. And Electronic Fun with Computers and Games ran a feature about games and their clones, going after the similarities and differences between all the VCS Star Raiders style games, including this one, though it didn't really judge which was better than the rest. Alongside the home version of Berserk and certain impending licensed games, this was one of the centerpieces of Atari's fall ad campaign. Star Raiders was the final VCS game of 1982 to come bundled with an Atari Force comic, but there were also rumblings of publishing a Star Raiders 4-issue miniseries in 1983. This would have been part of an initiative to turn a number of high-profile Atari games into an ongoing DC comic book, with multiple stories in each issue, as Warner owned both companies. Veteran comic creators Elliot Maggin and Jose Luis Garcia Lopez were tapped to create the Star Raiders book, and had come up with approximately 80 pages of story and action. This wound up being reduced to about 64 pages for the trade paperback that came out in the summer of 1983 instead. Star Raiders also was one of Atari's games that got a children's audio storybook, with a record bundled with a physical book telling a pretty basic story about two humans fending off an attack by Krylons. Despite the reviews and the media push, there's little information to go by on how well the VCS Star Raiders did. In the snippets we have of Atari's early 80s sales figures, Star Raiders doesn't appear. In the 1986 to 1990 period we do have internal figures for, Star Raiders wound up selling 6,154 copies through 1989, a figure that combines the SKUs that bundled it with the touchpad, controller, and those without it. Considering the video touchpad caused the game to sell at a premium price tag, this probably impacted how many copies Atari could sell, as well as broader factors such as the market overheating, Atari's large piece of the market getting eaten away by other companies, and the overwhelming popularity of arcade conversions over original, homegrown works. Star Raiders also nearly wound up using another bizarre VCS niche controller. At the 1983 Summer Consumer Electronics Show, Atari showed off the Voice Commander, a headset controller with VCS and 5200 versions that would let players issue commands rather than mess around with button presses. This was a joint project with Milton Bradley, which had made a voice recognition and speech synthesis module, the MBX Expander, for the Texas Instruments TI-99 4A computer. Under this agreement, Milton Bradley was to make 10 games that used the Voice Commander, of which at least a few appear to have been reworkings of existing games, such as Star Raiders and Real Sports Baseball. The project wound up never seeing the light of day, and as of 2025, no surviving prototype units have turned up either. That said, voice controls actually would probably work remarkably well for Star Raiders. At the least, you wouldn't need to fumble with the video touchpad. As for Neubauer, he never revisited Star Raiders itself, but he did wind up being somewhat prolific on the Atari VCS in its twilight years. In the early 1980s, he took on contract work with 20th Century Fox to produce some VCS titles, specifically Alien, MASH, and Megaforce, none of which he felt were particularly good. He was still interested in contracting with Atari, however. As Neubauer tells it, in 1984 he pitched Atari on a tie-in VCS game for the movie The Last Starfighter, which was looking promising until Jack Tramiel bought the consumer division in July. Atari protos indicated that this was initially an original game called Universe that essentially just had The Last Starfighter title slapped onto it, with Neubauer crediting himself as Solaris on the title screen. In 1986, at which point he was working at a hardware design company elsewhere in Silicon Valley, Neubauer got a call from Atari Corporation. They were looking to publish some new VCS games and were interested in what he had been pitching a couple years earlier. His Last Starfighter program was revamped under the name Solaris with a more complex galactic map and became the star attraction of the console's fall 1986 lineup, taking some of the same cues as Star Raiders and expanding it into planetary landings and multiple sector maps. Neubauer wound up contracting to work on 2 more games for Atari after that, Super Football and Radar Lock. He also started development on a space game for the NES hardware dubbed the Solarian Patrol, where he scanned in some kit-bashed spaceships and built them as in-game graphics, but by the time it was completed he'd missed the market. No prototype has ever turned up, and he left the game space shortly thereafter, recognizing that the era of a single person making a commercial game had ended. Atari kept up with Star Raiders for some time, though. As mentioned, the game made an appearance on the Atari 5200 platform for its launch a mere month after this VCS take. Since the 5200 is essentially an Atari 400, this is almost identical to its elder brethren, save for some graphical quality of life improvements and the addition of analog controls. These were apparently notable enough changes for Atari to list them off in its press release about the game. While Star Raiders works just fine with the standard digital controllers used on the computer line, being able to fine-tune your controls makes this a welcome experience and a rare win for that system's janky controllers. It also reviewed about as well as the computer version, as evidently, even 2 years on, the game was holding up remarkably well. This version was most recently included in the Atari 50 collection, which added some options to reduce the slowdown when the game is calculating a bunch of stuff for, say, an explosion. On the 8-bit computers, 2 different versions of Star Raiders 2 were developed at different points. The first was being created by Eric Will Munder from Atari's corporate research division. He told Kay Savitz with the Antic podcast that he'd been tasked by a manager with Atari's coin-op division to build it out, though his team got split to work on both it and a coin-op Last Starfighter game, and was only a few months away from completion when he learned marketing had released a different, alternate Star Raiders 2. This second game was originally in development as a tie-in to The Last Starfighter before being reworked and released license-free in 1985 as Star Raiders 2. The most notable differences include the addition of shields and starbases, which were absent from the Starfighter version, as well as the removal of the frontier barrier entirely as a mechanic. This game essentially takes place within 2 separate star systems, your own and the Xylons, with you defending against 3 different kinds of ships while making periodic incursions into theirs to bomb their bases and skedaddle before you run out of energy or are destroyed. The loop here is reminiscent of Star Raiders, but is pleasantly distinct. The Tramiels did give Will Munder the approval to keep working on his own Star Raiders 2, albeit without any sort of paperwork affirming that it was paid. Not long after, he received a job offer from Lucasfilm and left Atari, with his game unreleased until he worked with Savitz to release the ROM and his materials in 2015. This version also features the ability to orbit and bombard Xylon bases, and has a moving targeting cursor, but otherwise largely plays like the original game with much nicer graphics. Munder told Savitz that the enemy AI was incomplete, which is reflected here by how often they just sort of circle a point in space and just take pot shots at you, periodically. The original Star Raiders also saw a faithful and enhanced port to the Atari ST, with the addition of new enemy types and a new approach to managing your map, scanner and aft view using a console screen. Despite these tweaks, it is recognizably Star Raiders and is just as fun as the original, even using most of the same controls. And Atari Corp had briefly worked on a Star Raiders 2000 for the Jaguar before rebranding it as Space War 2000, as evidently the game had been moving away from the playstyle of Raiders over the course of development. Despite this, Space War 2000 never wound up being completed either. The beta ROM that's been floating around for decades shows promise as a cockpit-style space combat game, reflecting its Star Raider roots, however. Over 15 years later, a remake surfaced on the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Windows PC that reimagines Star Raiders as more of a mission-based third-person flight game. Here you are effectively operating the fighter from Macross, playing a member of a squad of pilots. Completing missions allows you to choose another sector to warp to, and as you take out enemy ships, you can upgrade your own fighter. This didn't review particularly strongly, but it's a competent digital download game from a time when that typically meant something was lower budget. Beyond the official works, Star Raiders served as inspiration for contemporary games on other platforms, such as the Apple II, ZX Spectrum, and Intellivision, the latter's game debuting alongside the IntelliVoice add-on to provide alerts instead of on-screen messages. Future works like Elite, Wing Commander, Star Luster, and Star Fox 2 all have their roots in Neubauer's original, and one could reasonably consider this the progenitor of the various cockpit space combat games that have come out over the years since. And despite its age, Star Raiders holds up incredibly well. It is still one of the finest games of its era. While the VCS version isn't quite as notable, it's still pretty interesting, and worth trying out in its own right, even if you wind up going back to Star Master afterwards. Our other game this video is Submarine Commander by Matthew Hubbard. This is the last of the Sears exclusive releases, a series that saw 3 VCS games released in Sears stores in 1982, Steeplechase, Stellar Track, and Super Breakout, the latter of which was a timed exclusive through the holiday season. And while Super Breakout was nothing to sneeze at in 1981, Steeplechase and Stellar Track were based on an obscure old Atari arcade game and a widespread basic computer game called Star Trek, respectively, neither of which seemed terribly high profile. The late Ron Stringari, who worked at Sears as a buyer before being recruited by Atari to lead their marketing division, explained to me that Sears always liked having merchandise with store branding, a very common approach at the time, and moreover preferred exclusives, even going back to Atari's 1975 home Pong console, where Sears had initially proposed becoming the exclusive seller of that machine. While he didn't remember why any of these games were selected specifically, he believed they were all programs that had already been planned or thought up and were therefore offered to Sears, possibly with some minor alterations. Hubbard, Submarine Commander's developer, remembered things slightly differently, telling Scott Stilphen in a 2001 interview that Atari's marketing department simply had no faith in what he'd made, implying that this was why it only wound up going out through Sears. This does likely track. Much as with Steeplechase and Stellar Track, Submarine Commander is kind of an oddball game, and Atari probably considered it to have limited appeal, and therefore could probably get more money out of an exclusivity arrangement with Sears than by selling it themselves. As to Hubbard, this was his first VCS project after coming to Atari. A 1978 graduate of California State University Hayward with a degree in math and a minor in computer science, Hubbard went on to work at chip manufacturer AMI for a time before applying to work at Atari. With a recommendation from his former professor Jim Daly, he was hired in after a series of mixed message letters, receiving 2 in the same day that told him they weren't interested and also to come in for an interview, and a subsequent pair telling him he didn't get the job and that he was hired. From there, his boss Dennis Coble gave him a list of potential projects to choose from, and Hubbard opted to update the venerable 1977 VCS game Air Sea Battle for the new 4KB cartridge size. In practice, he wound up making a game that had more similarities with Midway's Seawolf arcade game. This isn't terribly surprising, as one of the game modes in Air Sea Battle, Submarine, was already a Seawolf clone and is evidently the one Hubbard had focused in on for his update. The key difference between Seawolf and Submarine Commander, aside from the perspective shift, is the lack of floating mines that block your shots. In this regard, Submarine Commander resembles Atari's unreleased 1978 arcade game Wolfpack, which had been in development by Coble and later Ed Logg. This had much in common with Seawolf in terms of firing on ships at different distances as they go by with a pair of torpedo tubes, but notably, it both lacked the mines and allowed the ships to change distances to the point they could essentially ram your sub. This isn't a function in Submarine Commander mind, but your targets having a way to attack you back shows up in both games. Submarine Commander is a real throwback to an earlier era of arcade games. Your goal is to sink as many ships as you can until you run out of fuel. There's no way to restore fuel either, making this effectively a timer-based game. Though, in this case, you do lose additional fuel every time you fire a torpedo or get hit by a depth charge. Enemies will emerge from either side of the screen and at varying degrees of verticality. Ships that are further away are smaller and harder to hit, but will be worth more points. You have to contend with slow tankers that take 2 torpedoes to destroy, fast-moving destroyers, and even faster and smaller PT boats, which are worth the most points. Both destroyers and PT boats can be sunk with one torpedo, but hitting them requires some luck or carefully paying attention to your sonar display, which will blink red when a ship is about to enter the screen. The exact position that flashes red indicates what part of the view they'll come out from. Torpedoes, meanwhile, alternate from your two tubes, similar to Wolfpack, meaning you have to pay attention to some degree as to when you can successfully take your shot. The game features 8 different game modes for 1 or 2 players, and functionally these choose which ships can fight back. On the default games 1 and 2, enemy ships will never try to attack you. On games 3 and 4, destroyers will sometimes drop depth charges, which you will need to move away from or take a hit, losing some of your fuel. Games 5 and 6 add depth charges to PT boats, while on games 7 and 8 all ships can fire back at you. If the difficulty switch is set to A, that respective player will also receive system damage when a depth charge connects. You could lose the usage of one of your torpedo tubes, your sonar, or your engine will burn fuel faster than usual. Despite the manual's insistence, Submarine Commander does not appear to have a distinct black and white mode either. Submarine Commander isn't necessarily bad, but it's an incredibly slight game for 1982. This is the same year that has seen games like Haunted House, Defender, Yar's Revenge, and Star Wars, and this is the same month as games like Star Raiders and Pitfall. This isn't even including other game consoles, as by this point in time, the Intellivision had titles like Utopia and Night Stalker, and the ColecoVision was reaching stores. Updating an old title like Air Sea Battle makes some sense, but this would have fit in better if it had come out in 1980 or 81. As it is, it's hard to recommend playing on anything but the highest difficulty options to make this shooting gallery a little more interesting and competitive. Very little coverage appears to exist of this game. Joystick gave it a brief review in its December 1982 issue, describing it as a basic shooting gallery game with elaborate graphics. The January issue gave it slightly more text, writing that it provides little challenge or entertainment value. An article about collecting rarer games from a 1983 edition of Electronic Fun with Computers and Games mentions it as one of the Sears exclusives, with no additional details. After completing Submarine Commander, Hubbard started work on Real Sports Baseball for the Atari 5200, but left the company before completing the project. He instead went to Activision, where he next developed the VCS game Dolphin, which we'll see down the line in 1983, and Zenji for the 8-bit computers in the 5200, before being laid off at the end of 1984. Hubbard took on some additional work in the gaming field after that for Electronic Arts, LucasArts, and as a subcontractor for Atari. Eventually, he completed a master's degree and moved into education, developing card and board games on the side. He appears to continue doing the latter, according to Moby Games. With the VCS's impending rebranding to the 2600, you can really see how far console gaming has come since the hardware's August 1977 debut. The shift in game complexity and sophistication has been slow and subtle over the 5 years the VCS has been on the market to this point, and these silver-labeled games going forward will reflect this, as we enter what was considered, surprisingly wrongfully at the time, the platform's twilight years. Next time, elevators and space objects.